Hi, today we're going to do a very quick overview of the four fields illustration, Jesus' strategy for ministry. When we look at this illustration, it's like a farmer who goes out into the empty fields and then he sows seed. And as those seeds sprout up, they become plants, and the farmer begins to nurture those plants. And then, as harvest time comes, he gathers them together. And in the process of doing this, he recruits more laborers to work in the fields. So these are the four fields. Now, when you look at this and you look at Jesus' ministry, you see him working in these four fields. First, he has an entry strategy. In Luke 19:10, he came to seek and to save that which is lost. So he entered into a lost culture. Next, he shared the gospel. And in particular, we notice he shares the gospel of the kingdom. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And as people receive the gospel, he begins to disciple them, help them become like him. And as these disciples gather and mature, they gather together in community or church. And what we see in Mark 3:14 through 15 is Jesus chooses them so that they might be with him. And so you can see the model of the church even before Pentecost as Jesus brings together the community of disciples. And then lastly is the laborers. In Luke 10:2, Jesus says, "The harvest is great, the laborers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out more laborers." And so we need these laborers to work in the fields. Jesus worked in the fields himself. He modeled and taught others how to work in the field as laborers, and then they continued the process in a clockwise manner of entering lost culture, sharing the gospel, making disciples, gathering together in church, and then developing the next generation of laborers. So let's take a look at each field and see how Jesus did each one. The first is the entry strategy. I can see three basic ways that Jesus entered into a lost culture. The first one is a benevolent attractional model. This is where Jesus practiced acts of compassion. He goes in, he heals the sick, he casts out demons, he feeds people, and basically just uh, acts of compassion towards people. Another way that he enters lost culture is by going to the religious. He goes into the synagogue, or he dialogues with the Pharisees, or he dialogues with religious people, and here he finds some who will receive the message. And it was his habit to go to the synagogue every Sabbath. And then lastly is the person of peace or the house of peace, where Jesus enters in literally into someone's house or finds a person of peace who will be the point of contact, the person who enters into their relational network with the message that Jesus has given them. And the gospel spreads through that relational network, or in the Greek, the oikos. So there's three basic ways that I see Jesus entering into a lost culture. Now, what's really interesting, we don't want to split hairs over this, but the person of peace or house of peace strategy was actually prescribed twice in Matthew 10 and Luke 10. So we ought to pay very careful attention to that. Next is the gospel. Now, it's very important that we understand the gospel. We're not going to go into a theological discussion right here, but let's suffice it to say that we need to understand the gospel. Then we need to understand how to present the essence of the gospel. We may not be able to share everything in a 5-minute presentation, but we can present the essence of the gospel. And usually the way we do that is through our story, our testimony, and God's story, a short gospel presentation. Then we move to discipleship. Now, Jesus discipled his men through explanation, demonstration, application. He sent them out to do things. We want to disciple people in the same manner, and we know that there's short-term things that we want to address right up front. This is somewhere between 6 to 11 weeks, or the first 3 months. And then we have long-term discipleship that's going to run for the rest of our lives, learning to become like Jesus. And then we have what we call A-teams, accountability teams, in order to stay sharp in the spiritual disciplines, but ultimately the aim is to abide in Christ and become like him. Then we have the fourth field, which is church formation. This is being all that God intended us to be corporately. It is our corporate identity in Christ. It's just as important as our individual identity in Christ. And it's basically becoming the family of God. And we want to teach people how they are family and how to do church in a biblical way. And then lastly is laborers. We won't continue the process of discipling the next generation unless we develop the next generations of laborers. And so laborers learn to labor by laboring. We've found this over and over again. Help people get started at an early age as young disciples, and they'll figure out how to labor. It's for the next generation in order for us to continue to make disciples until Jesus returns, when he said in the Great Commission, "And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." And we want to do what Jesus did and repeat the process. So as Jesus entered a lost culture, shared the gospel, made disciples, formed community, churches, and then developed the next generation of laborers, we do the exact same thing in a clockwise manner. The process is repeated. So this is the four fields illustration. It's a simple overview, and we'll get into each field in detail later on.